Have you ever had a very specific fantasy of wielding a sword and shield while also being a spellcaster and protecting the party by any means necessary? Well, boy howdy do I have the job for you. Paladin is one of the two OG tanks of Final Fantasy XIV, and while it's had quite the tumultuous history in the past, looking at Dawntrail, it is in a fantastic position, and I'm here to tell you all about it. How the job functions at lower levels, and how it all comes together at level 100. Now you're probably wondering, who are you to make a guide on this job? What kind of credentials should you possibly... Oh, okay, never mind. With 2 full Savage tiers under my belt and 2 ultimates with several clears on them, I allegedly know what I'm talking about when it comes to Paladin, so I'm here to tell you about it. The way I'll be structuring this video is as follows. First, I'm going to talk about every skill that the job has up to level 50, including all the role actions, because for tanks specifically, it's very important. After that, I will be talking about every single skill that the job has in sequential order, and talking about how the job evolves as you level it up, until getting to max level, in which I will have a final section about how the job functions at level 100, and any other tips and tricks that I may have to share. If you want to skip around to any specific level range, or you just want to hear how the job functions at max level, there are timestamps in the description so you can jump around at your leisure. And so, without further ado, let's get into the guide. One of the most important things for Paladin is acquired at level 10. Iron Will is your tank stance. Once it's on, you will generate significantly more aggro when attacking than anyone else. You want to make sure that whenever you're killing bosses or regular enemies, that the enemies are attacking you. And that's what Iron Will is for. You don't want a tank buster aimed at a squishy DPS and watching them die instantly. You don't want that. You want that tank buster to be aimed at you. That's why it's called the Tank Buster after all. In terms of how Paladin actually deals damage, the basics are as follows. You have your basic 3-part combo of Fast Blade into Riot Blade into Rage of Halone. This is what you do whenever you're targeting just one enemy. If you're targeting several enemies at once, like pulling trash mobs in dungeons, you have the 2-piece combo of Total Eclipse into Prominence. The idea is very simple. If targeting 1 or 2 enemies, use your single target combo. If targeting 3 or more enemies, use your Total Eclipse combo. You also have Fight or Flight, which increases all of your damage dealt by 15%. This is a very important skill in Paladin's arsenal, and is something you'll want to be using as often as you can while damaging enemies. You also gain access to Shield Lob, which is a ranged attack. You won't be using this very much at higher levels because you'll get an alternative to it, but at lower levels you can use Shield Lob to freely attack at a distance. While it doesn't do that much damage, it's still better than doing no damage. You can also use this to pull enemies from a distance to make them start converging onto you, which makes grabbing mobs a whole lot easier. To round out your kit, you have Spirits Within at level 30. This is just a single target off global ability, which just does some extra damage. You also gain Circle of Scorn at level 50, which is a similar thing, except it's an AoE around you that also puts a small dot on everything struck. These 2 skills will be your bread and butter whenever they come up. With their 30-second cooldown, just use them when they come up. Even in AoE, use Spirits Within, it's free damage. In terms of Paladin-specific defenses, they actually get a couple. At level 35, they gain a trait called Oath Mastery, which gives them their Oath Gauge. Oath Gauge is the only non-healer gauge in the entire game that has nothing to do with offense. It's purely for defense. Oath Gauge at this level only works with the new skill you get at the same level, Sheltron. It reduces the damage you take by 15% for 4 seconds, which isn't a lot, but hey, it's an option. Also, Sheltron's actual cooldown is only 5 seconds, so you can use Sheltron once and then use it again instantly, assuming you have full gauge. At level 38, you gain access to Sentinel, which is a very simple ability. 30% damage reduction for 15 seconds, on a 2-minute cooldown. Very simple. At level 45, you get the most niche skill in the entire game, Cover. Cover puts a tether on another player of your choosing, and any damage they take is directed back to you. If they're going to get hit by let's say, a raid-wide AoE from a boss, and they're going to die from it, you can cover them so they don't take the damage and potentially save their life. Cover is very niche simply for the fact that it has a 2-minute cooldown and costs 50 oath gauge, which is better used on Sheltron in basically every situation. So cover is relegated to just being an emergency option. Keep it in your back pocket just in case, but don't plan on using it very often. Finally, at level 50, you get Hollowed Ground. This is your tank invulnerability skill, and it's very simple. Press button, for 10 seconds you take no damage. Very simple, very straightforward. It does have a 7 minutes cooldown, so you're not going to be using this very often. Its main use cases in dungeons specifically is to just take no damage from mobs. It can sometimes help your healer out if they're struggling, or just give the healer free reign to just do damage for 10 seconds. Before we move on to any other skills that the job has, we next need to talk about roll actions, because roll actions are very important for tanks. First, at level 8, you gain access to Rampart, which is one of your bread and butter skills. You take 20% less damage for 20 seconds. Very simple, very straightforward, and is a cult classic for a reason in a tank's loadout. At level 12, you gain access to Low Blow, which is an ability that stuns the target. You're not going to be using this very often, but there are situations in very low level dungeons where you can stun enemies, or even bosses, and even in some very niche cases like in one of the Dawntrail expert dungeons, Low Blow can be very useful, but its use cases are very few and far between. At level 15, you gain one of the most important skills in any tank's arsenal, Provoke. Provoke takes the aggro table and puts you at the very top, while also giving you a little bit extra. This effectively means that you now have aggro when you press Provoke, no questions asked. This is mainly used for tank swapping, when you need to swap who currently is holding the boss, or if you end up missing an enemy while pulling mobs in a dungeon, you can use Provoke to quickly pull that enemy to you. It is a very important skill, and you need this on your hotbar, I swear to God. At level 18, you gain access to Interject. Have you ever seen cast bars flashing red like this? Those are interruptible. You can use a skill like Interject, and boom, their skill is interrupted. Very simple. You won't use it very often, but there are niche cases like, for example, Dragon Song's Reprise Ultimate, where it actually comes up. So keep it on hand just in case. Another one of the most important tank skills for basically all content is gained at level 22, in the form of Reprisal. Reprisal reduces the damage of every enemy around you by 10%. Not just the enemy you're targeting, but everything in a circle around you. This makes it very useful for dungeons, because when you pull multiple mobs, you can make all of them do less damage. Also, neat thing to note is that Reprisal, despite the fact it's gained at level 22, can be used in lower level dungeons. This is because roll actions can be used at any level regardless of what content you're doing, so you can take Reprisal into Sastasha to help with the mobs. And this also works for the next roll action. Arm's Length is gained at level 32, and it has two functions. The one you're going to see most often is the knockback resist. Any form of knockback, with some exceptions, are completely ignored when you hit Arm's Length. However, the one that's relevant to tanks specifically is the second effect. When you get hit by a physical attack while Arm's Length is on, you will inflict a slow on the enemy. The main use for this is they will attack 20% slower with their autos. This effectively means they hit you less often, you take less damage. Arm's Length is damage mitigation. So please, for the love of God, use this in dungeons, I beg. And finally, at level 48, you gain access to Shirk. Shirk is mainly used for tank swaps when you have two tanks. When one tank provokes, even though they have bonus aggro, the other tank does have a chance to steal it, so Shirk takes 25% of your current aggro and pushes it onto whatever target you choose, which should be the other tank. This gives the other tank a comfortable lead in aggro, so they don't have to worry about you stealing it, unless they decide to AFK and not do damage. And that's Paladin up to level 50. It is a very straightforward job. One thing you're going to have to get used to is using your damage mitigations in dungeons specifically. You're taking damage from several sources at once, so you want to reduce that damage as much as possible. That's where all your defensive skills come in. Rampart, Arm's Length, Reprisal, Sheltron, and Sentinel all come in handy for this. Do not use them all at once because you want to space them out. Not only will you want to have them spaced out because there's just so many enemies you're going to tank, there's also bosses that have tank busters, so you want to have options available. Typically Sheltron can cover dungeon tank busters very well, but you still want to have baby Rampart available, so you'd use Rampart on the first set of mobs, and then you'd save it for the boss. Arm's Length, once again, is a fantastic option for making enemies attack slower, and Hollowed Ground is your emergency button, just in case your healer is struggling, or you're just running low on HP and need a panic button.
Oh, and before I forget, you also have Shield Bash. There's no reason to use it. Just ignore it, throw it in the trash, whatever.
Now that we've explained everything that the job has up to level 50, let's start putting in the extra skills you get beyond level 50 to see how the job evolves from here. The first thing you get beyond level 50 is Bulwark at level 52. One thing I didn't mention about Paladin at this point is that it has a block chance, exclusive to it. There's an RNG chance every time you get hit that you may reduce the damage by 20% by blocking it. Bulwark makes that chance guaranteed. It's effectively an extra mitigation button. It's kind of like Rampart, except it doesn't work on any enemy that has damage over time effects, which can be kind of rough, but it's not something that happens too terribly often in dungeons. It's just a second Rampart, kind of. And it's really good because of it. At level 54, you gain the trait Enhanced Fighter Flight. This makes Fighter Flight also give a second buff called Goring Blade Ready, which allows you to use the skill Goring Blade. That's crazy. Goring Blade is a very powerful single target GCD, which hits for 700 potency, but requires the buff to use. So this is basically the game telling you, hey, you see Goring Blade? Use it under buff. It's very powerful, and yeah, you should do that. Even in mob pulls where you're dealing with several enemies at once, it's better to use it on the highest HP enemy of the dungeon pull instead of letting it go to waste. It's just free damage. And in single target scenarios, oh boy, this hits like a truck. At level 56, you gain access to Divine Veil. This is what's known as your raid-wide mitigation. Everyone in the party gets a 10% HP shield, which effectively just means they have 10% more HP while this is on. This helps a lot with raid-wide mids, as it's called, raid-wide mid, and is going to be a very crucial piece of your endgame kit, so keep this in mind. At level 60, you gain the trait. Wait, what do you mean you get a skill level 58? What, huh? Oh my god. At level 58, you gain access to Clemency. Oh no. Clemency is a casted skill that heals the target. If you don't have any target, it heals you. If you target another party member, it heals them for 1000 potency, and you receive 50% of that heal yourself as well. The skill isn't used very much. There are two reasons you would use this skill. Either A, you have a downtime phase where the boss disappears and you want to help the healer heal. Or B, your healer's dead and you need to keep the party alive so you can recover the boss run. That's basically it. It's not practical to use in uptime situations because you're sacrificing damage to heal. While this can be useful in emergency situations, in a practical situation, you're not using it. However, one thing that will be very useful later on is the trait Chivalry, which you also get at level 58. This gives Riot Blade and Spirits Within an extra effect which gives you MP. Not very useful when Clemency at this level takes
4,000 MP to use,
but will be very helpful later on. And finally at level 60, you gain a trait called Rage of Halone Mastery. This upgrades Rage of Halone into Royal Authority, which is functionally the exact same skill, it just has a new animation and higher damage. And yeah, that's it. What else do you want me to say? Paladin at level 60 is functionally identical to its level 50 counterpart, with the main difference being that you get a Goring Blade every minute as well for bigger damage. But if you know how to play the level 50 Paladin, congratulations, you can play at level 60. However, the next level range is when things get very interesting. At level 62, you gain the skill Intervention. It's a very simple skill. You put a buff on another party member that makes them take 10% less damage. Also, if you currently have Rampart or Sentinel currently on you, that effect is increased by another 10%. This is basically cover if it was good. You don't take the damage, you instead make them take less. You can use this on DPS that take Vuln stacks and would die to the very next raid wide to keep them alive and make the healer's job easier, or on the other tank to help them with tank busters. I'll go more in depth on Intervention later, especially when it gains a new function, but oh boy, unlike cover, have this on your bar ready to use. This is a very important skill. Speaking of important skills, at level 64, you gain a few things. First is the trait Divine Magic Mastery. All MP costs on magic skills at this point is cut in half, so Clemency only costs 2000 MP. Hooray! You also gain the new skill Holy Spirit. Remember when I said Shield Law wasn't going to be used for much longer? This is why. Holy Spirit is a single target casted magic attack which does 300 potency. However, the real juicy bit is in the second half of Divine Magic Mastery's description. Royal Authority has a new effect where, upon use, it gives you a buff called Divine Might. Divine Might allows you to use Holy Spirit instantly with no cast time and at a higher potency. This effectively means that you have yourself a new ranged attack that does more damage, and Holy Spirit is now a core part of your rotation. Now, instead of your combo just being Fast Blade, Riot Blade, or Royal Authority, you now have Holy Spirit to tack onto the end. You don't have to use Holy Spirit after Royal Authority though, you can save it for later by then using Fast Blade into Riot Blade, because it's not a combo action, it's a buff that allows you to use the skill with these extra effects, so you can stockpile this for later. This is very important for what we're going to be talking about at max level. At level 68, I'm going to pretend I can pronounce this, and I'm instead going to call it By God's Light I Smite You. This is an off-global melee attack that you use once a minute, so you'll use this right after fight or flight. The real juicy bit is the smiting buff it gives you. This gives you 4 stacks of the buff, which allows you to use Holy Spirit as an instant cast with a higher potency. That sounds a whole lot like Divine Might, you say. Well, it is. However, you get to use it 4 times in a row, and the potency is even higher. At this level, when you cast Holy Spirit normally, it hits for 300 potency. With Divine Might, that potency goes up to 400. With Smite, it goes up to 600, which is a massive increase, and you can use it at this 600 potency 4 times in a row. This means that the first sightings of Paladin's burst phase has finally shown its face. Once you use Fight or Flight, you'll have a Goring Blade to use, and then potentially 5 Holy Spirits in a row, because if you're playing properly, you'll also have a Divine Might proc as well. One thing to keep in mind for early levels is if you have Divine Might and Smite on at once, you use Holy Spirit and it'll use the Divine Might buff first, then the other one, which means you will have to press Holy Spirit 5 times in a row sometimes. And this is how Paladin's burst phase is going to work for a while. Oh wait, there's another skill. At level 70, you gain one of my personal favorite skills in the game, Passage of Arms. This skill makes Paladin unique in the fact that it has 2 forms of raid-wide mitigation. Passage of Arms is a bit more niche though. When you just press the button, your character takes a defensive stance and you have guaranteed blocks for the entire duration. Additionally, any party member that's behind you takes 15% less damage. I know the tooltip is worded weird, but trust me, it's a 15% damage mitigation. One thing to keep in mind is that for full uptime phases, you don't have to channel it for the full duration. You can instead do what we call flashing your wings. You just press the button, and any character that is physically behind where your character's facing in the moment will get a buff called Arms Up. This is the damage mitigation, and it lingers for a few seconds when they leave the wings. This means that you can still apply it before raid-wides, provided the party is stacked up close enough together. This allows you to mitigate raid-wides even more than other tanks. Now that you have technically 3 options in the form of Reprisal, Divine Veil, and Passage of Arms, you have the most ways to reduce incoming damage. While Passage of Arms is incredibly niche because it requires the party to be bunched together when those situations come up, it is phenomenal for those situations. It helps your healers a ton. However, one problem you're going to start running into for Paladin at this point is the fact that you're pretty squishy by this point. Other tanks have some fantastic options that allow them to either heal themselves or just have more self-mitigations for themselves. And while it doesn't get better in the next level range, there are a few key skills in the next level range that absolutely define the job. At level 72, you gain a couple things. First, you gain Holy Circle. This is the same skill as Holy Spirit, except it's an AoE. This also comes with the trait Enhanced Prominence. Prominence now also gives Divine Might, and Divine Might can be used on Holy Circle. This means that your AoE rotation now consists of Total Eclipse, Prominence, into Holy Circle. It gives your AoE just a little bit of extra punch. At level 74, you also gain a couple things, but these two are a little less important. First is Enhanced Sheltron, which increases its duration from 6 seconds up from 4. Hooray! Also at level 74, you gain Intervene. Finally, a gap closer. Except, you're not really going to be using it for that. You're going to be using it for damage mostly, because it has damage tied to it. So, get used to using this under Fight or Flight. There are situations where you can either hold a stack for certain movement mechanics, or you'll have a stack available and you can use it for movement at that point, but if neither of those situations apply, damage, damage, damage. Level 76, however, is one of the most important levels for Paladin. You gain a new trait called Sword Oath. Royal Authority gets another new effect. This time, it gives you a buff called Atonement Ready. This gives you access to a new 3-part combo of Atonement, Supplication, and Sepulchre. Yes, that's how it's pronounced. I will not have this argument. Atonement has the same potency as Royal Authority, with Supplication and Sepulchre having increasing potencies as the combo goes on. This gives you even more stuff to throw into Fight or Flight. We'll be talking more about this at the max level section because there's a bit of nuance to it, but effectively you want to make sure you have some of these skills available once you're done with your main Fight or Flight burst. Speaking of your Fight or Flight burst, at level 80 you gain a new trait called Enhanced Smite, which allows you to use Confiteor, or as I'm going to call it, Confetti, because it's funnier. Confetti's potency at first doesn't seem that impressive until you look at the Smite potency. Jesus Christ. 920 potency as an AoE. This means that Paladin's burst phase has changed a little bit. Instead of using 5 Holy Spirits in a row, assuming you also have Divine Might, one of those Holy Spirits is replaced with Confetti, because it just has so much more damage. After using Confetti, you're still using Holy Spirits, but this just gives your burst a little bit of extra punch, and also your AoE rotation a bit of extra punch, because that's still 460 potency to every other enemy around you. That's more than a Smite buffed Holy Circle. It's a lot. Now, Paladin is pretty solid by this point, but it's still missing key aspects that make it truly special. And the next level range, oh man, things get wild. At level 82, there's a lot to unpack here, so let's just take it one step at a time. First, you gain a new trait called Sheltron Mastery. This upgrades Sheltron into Holy Sheltron. It still costs 50 gauge like normal, however the effects have changed a little bit. First, you have 2 separate damage mitigation buffs at the same time that stack on top of each other to about a 27% damage mitigation because of how the game calculates damage mit like this. This is already a far cry from before, with one buff lasting 8 seconds and the other lasting 4. Additionally, you also gain an extra buff called Knight's Benediction, which gives you a 250 potency regen for 12 seconds. This effectively means you gain a clemency's worth of HP over time once you hit Holy Sheltron, which is insane. This gives Paladin some much needed self-sustain that it did not have at all. And we're not done yet, because at level 82 you also gain Enhanced Intervention, which gives Intervention a second damage mitigation buff on top of that, and gives the target the Knight's Benediction regen, which allows you to put that regen somewhere else. This is what makes Paladin such a fantastic co-tank for higher end content, because you can put Intervention on your co-tank and put Holy Sheltron on yourself, and assuming you're both taking tank busters at the same time, you both just take so much less damage, and you both have regens, assuming you have full gauge going into it, which is amazing. And we're not done yet, because at level 84, you also gain 2 new traits. First is Melee Mastery, which just increases the potency of some of your skills. That's not really important. The real juicy bit is Divine Magic Mastery 2, which adds a cure potency to Holy Spirit, Holy Circle, and Confetti. This means that at long last, you have self-healing built into your rotation like the other tanks do. Additionally, you also have self-healing on your entire burst now, because your burst is Confetti into Holy Spirits, and they all have healing attached to them. This also helps with AoE mob packs, because you're going to have extra health while the mobs are eating you alive. At level 86, you gain a new trait, Spirits Within Mastery, which upgrades Spirits Within to Expiation. It's functionally the exact same skill, with the main difference being that it has AoE attached to it. So, you can actually use this skill for AoE. What fun! At level 88, you gain yet another new trait in Divine Veil Mastery. Divine Veil now has a 400 potency heal attached to it, on top of the shielding. This gives Divine Veil that little bit of extra utility, which helps healers out a lot. 400 potency may not sound like a lot, but trust me, any little bit helps. And finally, at level 90, you gain 3 of the most fun skills to use in the entire game. Blade of Faith, Blade of Truth, and Blade of Valor. These 3 skills effectively turn your Smite combo into just these 4 skills: Confetti, Blade of Faith, Blade of Truth, and Blade of Valor. No more using those stacks on Holy Spirit, it is now used on these 4 skills exclusively. And this is just using Confetti 3 more times with higher potency and AoE attached to it. This juices up Paladin's burst to a very absurd degree, especially in dungeons, because sure, Holy Circle does some pretty good damage with the Smite buff, but no, these 3 skills absolutely shred through mobs, and it's just really satisfying to watch the gigantic sword come down and just... This is where Paladin really comes into its own. It is a very defensive tank with some good self-healing and damage to boot, but we're still not done because we still have the level 100 range to get to, and it just keeps getting better. At level 92, you gain Sentinel Mastery, which upgrades Sentinel to Guardian. This is something that every tank gets. Their 30% damage mitt gets upgraded to a new skill. Its damage mitigation goes from 30% to 40%, but the neat little thing is the extra effect it has. Guardian specifically gives you a 1000 potency shield on top of it. For a similar analogy, it is a Clemency's worth of shield added on top of the damage mitigation. This skill is ridiculous. This skill alone made the Emerald Weapon Orbs just a non-issue, because it's... I'm sorry, this move is ridiculous. Because of how strong this mitt is, plus you just using Holy Sheltron on top of it as well, there are a lot of times where you'll just take 0 damage from a Tank Buster. Even in Savage, you'll take 0 damage from Tank Buster sometimes. It's just... It's hilarious. I'm sorry. I'm slightly going off script, but this button is insane, and it just keeps getting better. At level 94, you gain Melee Mastery 2, which gives you even more increased potencies. There's a lot to go into here, but this is not the video for it. The other thing you get is Enhanced Rampart, which gives it an extra effect. Specifically, you take 15% more healing while Rampart is active. This helps in basically every situation. It helps in dungeons because it makes healer's job even easier, because you're reducing damage while also receiving more healing, and also has some neat synergy with scholars. It's just a good effect. What else is there to say? At level 96, you gain Smite Mastery, which upgrades the skill into Imperator, a word I can actually pronounce. Effectively, Imperator is the exact same skill, but it has a few key differences. In fact, a lot of key differences. First, the damage is doubled, so it's just more damage. Secondly, it's now an AoE, so it's even more useful in dungeons because it just hits everything in a circle around the target. And thirdly, the fun part is that you can use this at a distance. You're no longer required to be up close and personal to an enemy to use it. You can use this whenever you want, which has some very good applications to keep your rotation rolling when your fight or flight comes up. And man, is it very satisfying to use. At level 98, you gain Enhanced Reprisal, which increases Reprisal's effect duration to 15 seconds. This also helps a lot in dungeons because you're just gonna take less damage for longer. This also helps in raids because some bosses hit multiple times, and this just covers more. It's a fantastic trait that sees a lot of use, both in dungeons and in higher end content. And finally, at level 100, you gain Enhanced Blade of Valor. Blade of Valor gives you a new buff called Blade of Honor Ready, which allows you to use, well, Blade of Honor. Blade of Honor replaces Imperator on your hotbar once you have the buff, and it's just an extra off global. A 1000 potency off global to be exact. This, on top of everything else, juices Paladin's burst up to even higher degrees because Blade of Honor is also AoE. This gives Paladin some ridiculous AoE damage, and just as ridiculous single target damage as well. And now, with every single skill that Paladin has talked about, let's talk about how it all comes together into what we see as level 100 Paladin. First of all, in terms of your burst phase, it is as follows. You use Fight or Flight and weave Imperator in afterwards. Then you use Confetti into Blade of Faith, Truth, and Valor, weave in Honor afterwards, then use Goring Blade, and then use Atonement, Supplication, and Sepulchre afterwards. Once you're done with that, you'll use Holy Spirit, assuming you're using a potion at this point, and then your filler phase begins. Filler phase is effectively just using Fast Blade, Riot Blade, Royal Authority, and now this is where things get more interesting. Your goal for subsequent fighter flights is to stockpile as many of these resources as possible. To make it easier to follow, here's a priority list of what you want to hit in fighter flight after your main burst is over. Sepulchre, Supplication / Holy Spirit, and Atonement / Royal Authority. You want to make sure that the top skills are used under fighter flight as often as possible. This means that you'll try to hold these skills as long as possible until fight or flight comes back up. Depending on how long you have until fight or flight comes back up, you can use Atonement to try and get the other 3 skills into fight or flight and then continue the rest of your combo until it comes back up. Once your main magic combo is finished, you can then throw in these 3 skills afterwards. Note that this is not always how it's going to happen. Worst case scenario is all of these resources are used up and all you have is Royal Authority to use. This is fine. While the goal is to hit your highest potency skills under fight or flight as often as possible, there may be situations where it's not always feasible. So you will have to make decisions on the fly based on where you are in your rotation and how long fight or flight has until it's back up again to decide what you want to do. Do note that hard casting Holy Spirit for alignment is not exactly worth it. Just do your rotation normally and it'll be fine. The best case scenario versus the worst case scenario in potency is so minimal that it's not a big deal. However, these minimal things do add up over the course of a 10-minute fight, so trying to do this is still absolutely worth it. In terms of Circle of Scorn and Expiation, you just press them under fight or flight and then use them when they come off cooldown. Very simple, very straightforward. Same thing with Intervene. You may have situations where you want to pocket it for a movement to make things easier for you, but you're not always going to have it, or it's just not worth it. So you'll just use Intervene for damage 9 times out of 10. Additionally, there are multiple situations where you will want to use your burst outside of the boss's hitbox. This works because Imperator is ranged, so you may have a situation where you run away from the boss as your buffs come up, but you can still do your rotation normally. Especially with how the fights are designed this expansion, there'll be a lot of on-the-fly decision making how you're going to use your ranged attacks. You may have your full burst up, you may only have a Divine Might proc ready to go. Based on what the situation is, you can plan accordingly. You can use your Holy Spirit right then and there, or you can just hard cast it depending on where you are. The absolute worst case scenario is using a shield lob, but you're going to be trying your best to not use it. In terms of defenses, Paladin is in a very unique position where it functions equally well as a main tank or as an off tank. Holy Sheltron is such a spammable skill that you can use it very often to give yourself regens and damage mitigation. However, if you're in the off tank role, just swap Holy Sheltron with Intervention and the effect is the same. Especially with how hard some of the auto attacks hit this expansion, you'll want to use Intervention on your co-tank at least a few times, especially during during auto heavy phases so they just don't keel over and die from taking mini tank busters over and over and over again. And if you're in that main tank scenario, do the same thing, but with Holy Sheltron. When you're taking tank busters, you're basically going to want to use Guardian every single time, on top of Holy Sheltron. These two skills alone just deal with tank busters on their own. Sometimes you'll want to add in a Bulwark to give yourself the extra block, and boom, 0 damage. Congratulations. However, depending on the fight, it will be on a case-by-case basis. Usually you'll be using Guardian on the tank buster, but depending on how frequent busters are, and if you're not using invulns, Rampart will be needed to be used in there as well. However, if you're main tanking, it may be wise to save Rampart for situations where you're taking multiple autos at once. Like in M2S, for example, during the towers at the start, you can use Guardian, Bulwark, and Holy Sheltron on the Buster at the beginning, and then during towers, assuming you're main tanking, you can press Rampart and mitigate those autos. And really, the last thing to talk about is to remember that Passage of Arms is a button that exists. If the party is stacked up for raid wides, then you're going to want to use it, because it's just free damage mitigation. Of course, it's not always going to be useful, but when the situation presents itself, you will want to use it. And honestly, I think that about does it for the guide. Paladin is a very simple job at the end of the day. Out of the tanks, I wouldn't say it's the easiest to play because Warrior exists, but it's definitely second place. Despite that, it is still a very powerful tank with a lot of good damage and a lot of ways to mitigate damage for both themselves and their party members. They are a fantastic co-tank and are probably one of the strongest tanks in the game right now. I don't know, Gunbreaker is very high up there as well. But if you want to pick up the Sword and Shield for this current Savage tier, or if you're planning on picking it up for the next Ultimate, or you just want to have fun with it in general, I hope that this guide was of use to you. If there's anything I may have missed, or if you have any other questions about anything related to Paladin, please let me know in the comments below. I'd love to hear what you guys have to say. And also just any feedback on the guide in general. This is my first time making a video like this in general with a somewhat loose script, so I'd like to hear your thoughts on this type of content. And if you want to see more, like you want to hear me talk about Warrior or something, like another tank, or even just another job, does that interest you? If it does, let me know. I'd love to hear it. Anyway, this has been Kamui Bushida, and until next time, confetti.